Good evening. Tonight I'm going to make a video. It's going to be the first in a series of videos I'm going to start making where we're going to look at the deep editing parameters on the amp models in Helix. So basically we're going to be looking at sag, ripple, hum, bias, bias X, all those controls that nobody ever messes with. First one we're going to look at is sag and what that does to your tone and how you can use it to make your amp behave certain ways. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start with a real amp. What I have here is my Fuchs ODS, and the reason I'm using this amp is because I know it exhibits sag and I can demonstrate it in a real live patient, so to speak. And then we're going to go into the Helix, and we're going to look at a couple different Helix models, and we're going to see how the sag control affects those models, and then we're going to see, we're going to use a compressor, and we're going to see how a compressor behaves similarly and how a compressor behaves differently than a sag control in an amp. So here we go. Okay, so for the first part of this test, what I want to do is I want to take a look at a real amp, and we're going to see what sag does on a real amp and how it behaves. So what we're going to do is we're going to run a signal into my Fuchs. What I have set up here is I have a patch, and we're coming in on my guitar input, and we're going out 1/4 inch, and we're all going through my spectrum analyzer, my oscilloscope actually over here. And in the patch right now, everything else is off. The only thing that's on is this effects loop, which in that loop is where I have my Fuchs. So we're going to start by running a -18 dB signal into the amp, and we're going to see what we get. Okay, so we have a nice sine wave. As we turn it on and off, back to flat line, comes back on, just a nice sine wave. The amp's not struggling. This is not a loud enough signal to starve the amp for power. So it's just behaving like a normal amp, and just up comes a sine wave, everything's happy. So next I'm going to take the amplitude of the wave to -10, and let's see what happens when we go to -10 dB with the real amp. Okay, now as you can see now, watch when I just initially first turn it on. The wave starts a little bit bigger and it shrinks down, and then it recovers just a little bit. I'm hoping the frame rate on this is fast enough that you can catch this. But it starts bigger and then it shrinks a little bit. Now let's continue to go up, and let's take this up to -2 dB, or to +2 dB. And this is a pretty loud signal. This is going to make the amp work pretty hard. Now watch what happens. Okay, now watch, as I turn it on, watch the waveform start as one thing and change to another. See? Let's do it again. It shrinks, it compresses, and the waveform actually changes shape a little bit. And that is the amp compressing and struggling for power. Okay, so that is how a real amp compresses. It's pretty quick, and again, I'm hoping that the frame rate catches all this. But so what happens is, with an amp, is the amp's idling, it's doing nothing, it's just sitting there, and all of a sudden you hit a chord, and the amp gets called for a lot of power all of a sudden. Now the amp has plenty of power in store because hasn't been doing anything, and that initial transient note comes through really loud, and then as the amp is continuing to have to draw power, it may not have the power available. Some amps do and some amps don't. And so as it continues to call for power, sometimes it struggles for power and recovers a little bit, or sometimes it just continues to struggle for power, it just can't handle it, and it compresses. And as the amp compresses, oftentimes the waveform shapes change. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I want to take a look at one of the Helix amps, and we're going to start with the line 6 Litigator. And we're going to go straight to that 2 dB signal, that loud signal right off the get-go, and we're going to hit the amp with that. So what I've done here is I've taken the Sag Control and I've turned it all the way down, and I'm going to put the signal to it. Let's see what we got. Okay, there we go. We've got our sine wave. Turn it off, turn it back on. Not sagging, not anything, just pops up, and there we go. So now what I'm going to do is we can do something cool with the Helix because I have these sag controls, so I can adjust it on the fly while the amp's running. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to take the sag slider and we're going to slide it on up from 0 sag up to 100% sag. And now let's watch this waveform and see what it does. And as I bring it up, You can see it's starting to compress, compressing more, and now it's on 10 and it's all the way compressed. So now you can see the difference from the rounded waveform, it's not quite a sine wave, but the rounded waveform to the highly compressed waveform as the amp sags. Now let's see what happens as we do the same test where we turn it on and off and see what the transient looks like. So we're off right now, and we turn it on, and you can see it shrink down, and you can see the waveform shape, similar to shape change, similar to what we saw in the real amp. It's a little bit more dramatic here, and it's a little bit slower, so it's easier to see. But again, you can see it compresses on down and becomes almost a squarish kind of wave, whereas it started out as a rounder type of wave. And that's the amp compressing and being starved for power. Okay, so now I'll turn off the litigator, and I want to take a look at another amp. And in this one, we're going to look at the Stone Age 185, because again, this is another amp that does a good job showing us the sag characteristics. So we'll do the same thing. We'll turn with the sag. We'll start with the sag off. Now I've adjusted these amps to show the maximum amount of sag that I could demonstrate, because this is all about a demonstration. You wouldn't necessarily run this amp this way. The drive's really low here. But let's go ahead and let's turn the amp on now with the sag on 0. And you see we get a sine wave. The drive's really low. And now I'm going to take the sag and I'm going to bring it up. Let's watch and see what happens to the waveform. It starts to change, and it continues to change, and all of a sudden it collapses. It's starving for power, it makes a square wave. So let's turn the amp off, and now let's watch this amp change as the transient hits it. Okay, we're idle, amp's sitting there all happy, here comes a signal. Boom. And she's compressing. And then she's doing square waves. And again, off, sitting at idle, amp's happy, here comes a signal, collapse. Alright, so now that is what the amps do. So a lot of times they're distorting already, and they'll distort more. Sometimes in this case I was able to set one up that it was clean, and then as it called for power it actually compressed and distorted, so it went from clean to distorted. Again, it just depends on the amp and the controls and how the amp is modeled and what the real amp did, and a lot of variables. But this is how compression works. This is how sag works in an amplifier. So now, you hear the word compression a lot. You're like, well, what does a compressor do? How does a compressor behave similarly or differently to an amp? So I've got this compressor set up here. It's pretty quick. I hope the frame rate catches this. I've got this compressor set up here to take an incoming signal and then compress it significantly so you can see the transient change. And let's see what we get. So again, it's sitting there idle, no signal, turn it on, there you go. Big signal, on down to a little signal. Big signal, on down to a little signal. Let's do it a couple more times. And you can see it compresses right on down to that. Now the big difference here versus a guitar amplifier that's sagging is that this is still a sine wave. With the guitar amplifier in general, as that wave compresses, it changes shape. It doesn't stay a perfect sine wave. So this is essentially just getting quieter, whereas the amp is distorting more generally, or distorting differently as it compresses. So that's the big difference between a compressor and an amplifier. So I hope that was informative and gave you some ideas on how to set your amp up to increase the sensitivity and the dynamics and the feel of the amp, or to make it more structured and rigid and predictable, so to speak, and anywhere in between. And that's kind of where the Sag Control lives. It kind of adjusts how the amp feels, how it responds to your pick attack and your dynamics, and how hard you hit it and how soft you hit it. If you're going to be hitting it hard all the time and you want the amp to respond, turn the sag down. And if you want it to be touch sensitive and, you know, really dynamic feeling, bring the sag up. And you got to play with it and see how it works for you. But I hope that gives you some cool ideas, and I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like this video, please press like and subscribe. If you'd like more information on this, or more information about the Helix in general, I have a blog. I'll have the link down below, and I add material, I add content to that pretty much every week. It's an ongoing process, and and just let me know if there's anything in particular that you want me to cover in the Helix. Put it in the comments, and if I can do it, I will. Again, like and subscribe. Have a good evening.